I thought I'd seen it all, until the day I met that woman. It was late afternoon, the sun baking the dirt road, when I saw her, alone, just standing in the middle of nowhere, filthy, exhausted, looking like she'd been walking for days. I was still up on my horse when she looked up and caught my eye. There was something in that gaze. It wasn't just hunger. It wasn't just fatigue. It was as if she were running from something. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just some random road encounter. That August day, the heat had been brutal since dawn. It was that dry, high plains heat that sneaks up on you. Suddenly it's there, parching the air, scorching the back of your neck, sucking the moisture out of the world, as if everything were being held over a live coal. Dust rose in thin clouds from the dry earth, the kind that sticks to your throat and makes your eyes sting. I was riding along the road that cut through the middle of the ranch, running parallel to the cornfield on my left. Buster knew the way by heart. He didn't need the reins for that. He just moved at his steady, rhythmic gait, hooves hitting the dry dirt softly, his sweat-slicked flanks gleaming in the sun. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just that I needed to fix the fence in the lower pasture, that the float valve on the cattle trough was stuck again, that maybe on Friday I'd head into Silver Creek to pick up some wire and a few bolts, the kind of thoughts a man alone on a big ranch has. Small, concrete, secure. Then Buster lifted his head. It wasn't a startle. It was pure attention. He did that thing good horses do when they spot something before you can. He stopped, landing his hooves softly, and stepped a bit harder, as if he were bracing himself. I squinted against the glare. Up ahead, where the road curved near the edge of the corn, I saw movement. It wasn't a natural gait. It was a drag, heavy, crooked, as if someone were pulling their own world behind them. I let out a slow breath. Buster had already slowed down on his own. As the distance closed, I saw it clearly. First, the cart, old weathered wood worn down to a dull grey. One wheel was slightly warped, making the frame shudder with every yard in a dry, rhythmic creak. The canvas cover was long gone, just some rusted wires holding together boards that looked tired of holding onto each other. Then I saw her. A woman, alone. Her body leaned forward at an angle that made my back ache just looking at it. A thick rope was looped over her shoulders, tied to the cart. She was the beast of burden, barefoot. I could see the soles of her feet every time she lifted a heel, dark with dirt, the edges cracked and split. And behind her, inside the cart, her children. 2 of them, sitting side by side, too quiet for kids. The boy looked about 8, the girl maybe 5. Both staring ahead with blank expressions, with that look children get when they've learned not to waste energy on anything that isn't urgent. I got closer, and then I saw it, scattered among the bundles and the packages, the remnants of a whole life tied up in scraps of cloth, ears of corn, 3, 4, 5. I knew instantly that corn was from my field. I recognized it by the size, the still green husks, the way it had been yanked, not cut but torn off with force, leaving a piece of the stalk still attached. My blood pressure spiked. Any other man might have shouted, might have jumped off his horse, furious, demanding they drop everything, maybe worse. But I didn't, because something didn't add up. She wasn't running. She wasn't looking back with guilt. She wasn't trying to hide anything. She was just continuing. One step, then another. As if stopping wasn't an option in her vocabulary, Buster slowed even more, almost on his own. I climbed down. I tied the reins to the trunk of a gnarled cottonwood by the roadside and walked over slowly. The kids saw me first. The boy went rigid. The girl shrank back, clutching a folded blanket to her chest. And in their eyes, it wasn't fear. It was hunger, the deep kind. You recognize it because it has a specific look, a dimming, as if the light was slowly dying from the inside out. I'd seen it before. Back in the drought of '93, when parts of the Midwest dried up and burned and families came through our region on foot. I was 12, and I saw a kid with that same stare. Never forgot it. The woman didn't notice me until I was right there. Her body stopped before her brain did. She locked up for a second, the rope still on her shoulders, head down, breathing hard. Then she turned. I expected fear, but there wasn't any, just exhaustion. A weariness that seemed older than she was, as if it had arrived before she was born and had simply decided to move in. I looked at the corn, then at her. "You took this from my land, didn't you?" She didn't deny it. She didn't offer apologies or make up a story. She just said, with the voice of someone who no longer has the energy for lies, "My children were hungry." Simple as that. The boy squeezed an ear of corn tightly as if I were going to snatch it away. His little knuckles turned white. And that was the moment something inside me cracked open in just the right way, because I knew it was still theft. But I also knew that not every crime comes from malice. Sometimes people end up in a place where the only choice left is to break the law or watch their kids wither. And in that place, the rules don't work the same way. I stood in silence for a few seconds. I looked at the road behind her. Nothing, just dust, sun, and the silent plains on both sides. I looked ahead. Nowhere. "Where are you headed?" she answered without thinking, like a line she'd repeated to herself so often it had become automatic. "Far away. Anywhere they won't go hungry." I looked at her, at him, at her. I fought with myself, the way we do when we know the answer but are terrified of what it might cost us. It's not your problem. That's how I'd lived for years. I'd learned how to build that wall. I'd learned how to look at someone else's suffering without letting it in, because once you let it in, you're never the same again. But then the memory of my own kitchen table came back. The lonely plate, the silence filling the empty bedrooms. And for the first time in a long time, staying on the sidelines felt heavier than helping. I made a choice. One of those that doesn't come from the head. It comes from somewhere deeper, something you can't even name. Drop the rope. She looked at me, confused. I stepped to the front of the cart and grabbed the pull bar with both hands. "You aren't pulling this alone anymore." She didn't say a word, but her eyes flickered, not with gratitude, not yet. It was like someone who'd finally had a crushing weight lifted off their shoulders and needed a second to believe it was real. And right there, in the middle of that empty road, with the sun beating down without mercy and the dust hanging in the hot air, everything changed. But there was one thing I still didn't know, hidden under those corn husks at the bottom of that cart covered in old rags and tied up bundles. There was something hidden, something that wasn't just about hunger. And the very same day I decided to help that woman and her children was the day I walked into a problem I might not be able to get out of. What the cart was hiding. I'm not a man who asks questions before I have to. Lindalva always used to say that about me, that I preferred to understand things by what I saw rather than what I heard. I'd wait. I'd observe. I'd only speak when I'd gathered enough to make sense of it. Right then I was gathering a lot. I held the bar of the cart and started pulling slowly, feeling the weight. It was heavier than it looked. The old wood groaned every few feet, the crooked wheel thumping against the ground in an uneven rhythm that travelled up my arm like a warning. Buster followed close behind, reins loose, as if he'd decided this was our responsibility now too. The woman walked beside me. She'd taken the rope off her shoulders, but her back remained hunched, as if her body hadn't gotten the memo that the load was gone. She walked with her eyes on the ground, bare feet instinctively dodging the sharper rocks, with the grace of someone who'd never had the luxury of shoes. The kids didn't say a word. The boy watched me with narrowed eyes, wary in that serious way that hardened children get. Not out of meanness, but out of long-learned caution, knowing that a stranger's kindness sometimes comes with a price. The girl had laid on her side in the cart and closed her eyes. I couldn't tell if she was truly asleep or just pretending. I pulled for about 300 yards in silence. Just the squeak of the wheel, the rhythm of Buster's hooves, and the dry wind whistling through the scrubland like a lazy breath. That was when I smelled it. It wasn't the corn. It wasn't the dust. It wasn't the woman's sweat, which was strong but clean, the kind that comes from honest labor. It was something else, sweetish, heavy, with a sour, sharp note underneath that anyone who's lived on a ranch recognizes before they even identify what it is. The smell of a festering wound. I slowed my pace. I glanced at the cart. The rags at the bottom were piled in a way that looked messy, but looking closer, I realized it wasn't mess. It was a shroud. They'd been placed with care, one over the other, hiding what lay beneath. I stopped. The woman stopped too, without me saying a word. "What's under there?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at me with that same expression I was starting to recognize, not one of deceit but of calculation, weighing how much she could trust before opening up. "It's my mother," she said finally. Her voice was different, deeper. "She's bad off." I let go of the pull bar slowly. I walked to the side of the cart. "Can I see?" She hesitated for a second. Then she nodded. I carefully pulled back the rags, and what I saw caught the breath in my chest. It was an elderly woman. She had to be 70, maybe more, her face mapped with the deep lines the high plains sun carves into skin, her complexion the color of dry topsoil. She was lying on her side, knees drawn up, white hair tangled around her face. But it was her leg that grabbed my attention. The right leg was wrapped in rags, several layers thick, and the bottom of the bandage was stained with a dark, wet mark I knew all too well. Old blood. And beneath it, the sickly greenish yellow that left no room for doubt. "Infection. How long has it been like this?" I asked, my voice drier than I intended. 4 days, she replied. She fell, a rock cut deep. I cleaned it as best I could, bound it up, but the swelling wouldn't stop. 4 days. I looked at the sun. It was nearly 11 in the morning. The heat was at that point where it melts your thoughts. "Is she conscious?" "Off and on. She was talking earlier this morning. Now she's faded again." I rubbed my hand over my face. I did the math quickly. The nearest town was Silver Creek, about 22 miles away over dirt roads. With this cart, in this shape, pulled by a woman at the end of her tether, it would take at least 6 hours. With an infection at that stage, 6 hours was a lifetime. "What's your name?" I asked. She paused as if the question came from an unexpected angle. "Generosa." I didn't smile. It wasn't the time, but the name stuck. Generosa. That woman needs medicine. She needs a doctor. With that cart, the way things are, you won't make it in time. She looked at me without blinking. "I know," she said. "That's why I've been walking since last night." That silenced me. Walking since last night. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, not as someone who'd stolen corn from my field, not as a problem that had landed on my road, but as a person. 30-something maybe, thin in a way that wasn't natural. Arms with those long, wiry muscles of someone who'd been working since childhood, brown eyes, deep-set, with a stubborn glint that exhaustion hadn't quite managed to extinguish. A woman who had walked all night pulling her sick mother and 2 children in a beat-up cart through the plains, and yet she hadn't stopped. I turned to the boy. "What's your name?" "Artur," he answered. His voice was steady for his age. "And her?" I pointed to the girl. "Grazza." "Is she asleep?" "She's hungry," he said, blunt. "When she gets too hungry, she fades out like that." That hit me in the center of my chest like a rock. I didn't say anything. I walked over to Buster, opened the saddlebag I always carried, out of habit after years on the ranch, and took out what I had, 2 pieces of brown sugar candy wrapped in paper, a small canteen of water, and a handful of crackers I'd packed that morning without thinking much of it. I handed them to Artur. He looked at me, looked at the food, looked back at me. "Go ahead," I said. He took them, with both hands. He broke off a piece of the candy and put it in his sister's mouth. She opened her eyes slowly, chewed without really understanding where she was, and drifted off again. Only then did he eat. Generosa was watching me. I couldn't read that look. It was a mix of too many things: gratitude, shame, relief, suspicion, that whole tangled mess we feel when we're forced to accept help from someone who has no obligation to give it. "I'm going to get my other horse," I said. "I've got a gentle mare back at the stables. We'll rig up a makeshift stretcher for your mother, tie it between the two horses and get to town. It's the only way to get there before it gets worse." Generosa was silent. "You don't even know me," she said finally. "No." "Why are you doing this?" I thought about the honest answer for a moment. "Because if I don't, she's going to die. And those kids are going to be left without a grandmother. And you're going to have to carry that for the rest of your life, knowing that I saw you and just rode away." Pause. "And I already carry enough as it is. I don't need more." She stared at me for 3 seconds. Then, very slowly, she nodded. I tied Buster to the cart so she wouldn't have to guide it, and I started walking quickly along the shortcut to the corral. The ranch knew my steps. Every stone, every tree shadow, every turn in the path. But as I walked, one thing kept gnawing at me. The infection in that leg had been there for 4 days, and when I'd pushed those rags back and really looked, there was something Generosa hadn't told me. A red line, thin, almost imperceptible, snaking up from the ankle toward the calf. I knew that sign. Every rancher does. That wasn't just a wound infection. That was sepsis setting in. And sepsis doesn't wait for anyone. The unspoken. There are things we know but don't say, not out of cowardice, out of choice, because as long as it isn't spoken aloud, it still fits inside your chest without turning into despair. And despair, at that moment, was the one enemy I couldn't let in. I reached the corral at a quick pace, not running. Running invites panic, and panic gets in the way of what needs to be done. Serena, the mare, was in the inner paddock, a light buckskin with a white star on her forehead. She'd been gentle since she was a foal, accustomed to weight and to people. She saw me coming and walked over slowly, with that patient manner good animals have. "I need you today," I said to her in a low voice, stroking her neck. She stood still while I saddled her. Inside the house, I was fast. I grabbed what I knew I'd need: the bottle of rubbing alcohol from the medicine cabinet, the gauze rolls that Lindalva kept in a metal tin, a clean knife wrapped in a cloth, and 2 old blankets I'd used to rig a stretcher. I also took the money, my emergency cash, kept in an envelope in the back of the wardrobe, a reserve I never touched unless absolutely necessary. I counted it quickly without checking the total, folded it and put it in my shirt pocket. Before leaving, I stopped for a second in the middle of the living room. I looked at the picture of Lindalva on the side table, an old photo from a cousin's wedding. She was wearing a floral dress, laughing with her head tilted to the side. That laugh of hers that started in her eyes before it reached her mouth. I don't know how to explain what I felt in that second. I only know I left faster than I'd walked in. I headed back down the road at a short trot with Serena, the blankets tied to the cantle, everything rhythmic against her gait. The sun had climbed higher and the air was heavy. That oppressive dry heat common to the plains where there isn't enough shade in the world to hide from. Generosa was where I'd left her, standing by the wagon, soaking a rag in the last of the water to wipe her mother's forehead. Little Arthur had climbed down and was holding the reins of Tamanco with a seriousness that made him look like a man doing a job he couldn't afford to mess up. Grasa had opened her eyes and was staring at the sky with a serene expression that tugged at my heart. Small children have that way of existing in the middle of chaos and still looking like they see something beautiful that adults have stopped noticing. "You got it," Generosa said when she saw me. It wasn't a question. It was relief. I did. I dismounted Serena and went straight to the wagon. "How is she?" "She's groaned a bit. I think the pain is getting worse." Increasing pain was a sign the body was still responding. It was something. "I'm going to look at the leg before we move her," I said. Generosa hesitated. "It's going to hurt." "I know, but I need to know what we're dealing with before I put her on a stretcher." She let me. I carefully moved the rags aside. The woman, I still didn't know her name, furrowed her brow even while unconscious, a low groan escaping her lips. I worked slowly, unwinding the dressing layer by layer. The wound was on her shin, a deep gash about 2 inches long, deep enough to have hit the tissue under the skin. Someone had done their best to clean it. I imagined it was Generosa, probably with whatever was at hand, maybe moonshine, maybe just water. The effort was there, but it hadn't been enough. Infection had set in. The skin around the cut was hot, tight, with a dark discoloration in the center that wasn't good. And the red line I'd seen earlier was there, more visible now, creeping up toward her calf. I covered it back up without saying a word about it. "I'm going to clean it with alcohol and re-wrap it," I told Generosa. "Then we'll set up the stretcher and move." She was watching me with that look of hers, a look that calculated more than it asked. "It's worse than what you're saying," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. I paused. "It's serious," I said carefully, "but we'll make it in time if we go now." She nodded once, curtly, like someone who prefers a heavy truth over a light lie. I cleaned the wound with alcohol. She groaned deeper this time, her fingers tightening into the blanket, but she didn't wake. I wrapped the gauze firmly, but not too tight. As I did, Generosa stood by, holding her mother's hand, saying nothing. I watched them from the corner of my eye. The daughter holding the mother's hand in the middle of the scorched plains, in an old wagon, miles from anywhere, yet with that steady presence, that care that didn't need words. I thought of Lindalva again. I knew she would have done the same. That same stubborn affection of a woman who doesn't let go of those she loves, not even when the weight becomes too much. "What's your mother's name?" I asked, tying off the bandage. "Benedita," Generosa replied. Her voice softened on the name. "Everyone calls her Miss Ben." "Miss Ben," I repeated softly. I built the stretcher with the 2 blankets and some sturdy branches I cut from a nearby scrub oak, green, resilient wood, the kind that bends before it snaps. I tied the ends to the harness of both horses, one blanket overlapping the other to form a sort of sling. It wasn't perfect, but it was secure. Getting Miss Ben onto the stretcher was the most delicate part. I took her shoulders, Generosa took her hips, and we moved slowly, feeling every groan as a warning to be even gentler. Artur held the reins of both horses, solemn as a grown man, arms braced, controlling both animals with a calm that surprised me. When Miss Ben was laid out between the horses, she opened her eyes for a moment. She looked at the sky, then she looked at me. I don't know if she understood where she was or what was happening, but she watched me for 2 seconds with those deep, dark eyes, then closed them again. I felt that in my chest. "Let's go," I said. Generosa picked up Grasa. Artur climbed up behind me on Tamanco without needing an invite. He just waited for me to mount and reached out. I pulled him up, and he settled in front of the saddle with that natural ease of a country boy who's never been afraid of a horse. We started off. The road to Tesouras was long, and the sun wouldn't show anyone mercy. For 20 minutes there was only the silence of the road, the clatter of hooves, the slight creak of the stretcher, the dry wind. Artur sat in front of me, quiet, hands resting on Tamanco's neck, watching the road. He was the one who spoke first. "Do you live alone on the ranch?" "I do." "Always?" "No." A pause. "I used to live with my wife and my kids." "Did they leave?" "They did." He was quiet for a moment. "My father left too," he said without drama, with the naturalness of a child who had processed a pain and filed it away in the right place. "But ours was different. Ours didn't want to stay." I didn't answer. Sometimes silence is the most honest thing there is. A few minutes later, he spoke again. Were you really going to turn us in for the corn? I almost smiled. No, but you didn't need to know that at the time. He turned his head slightly as if to look at me, then looked back to the front. I knew, he said. And he stayed quiet the rest of the way. We were still 9 miles out when Generosa, walking beside the stretcher, suddenly said my name, or rather, not knowing it, she said, "Sir." The way she spoke made me look back instantly. She was staring at the stretcher. I looked too. Miss Benn was shivering, not from cold. The heat was 100 degrees, if it was a degree. It was that tremor that comes from within, the kind the body gives when something is terribly wrong in the blood. I knew it, and I knew what it meant. The time I thought it had just been cut in half, when the ground drops out from under you. There are moments in life when time changes its nature. It doesn't get faster or slower. It gets dense. Each second carries a different weight, as if the air had thickened around everything and every movement cost more than it should. That's how it was when I saw Miss Benn shivering. I stopped the horses with a soft gesture. No sudden movements, not with the stretcher, not with the risk to her. I dismounted Tamanco carefully, asked Artur to hold the reins, and knelt beside the stretcher. I brushed the back of my hand against her forehead. Too hot. That damp heat of a high fever, which burns differently than the sun. This one comes from inside, rising through the skin like a buried coal. "Miss Benn," I called softly. She didn't respond. "Miss Benn." A tremor in her lips. Her eyes moved beneath closed lids, but she didn't open them. Generosa was on the other side, also kneeling, her hands resting on her mother's shoulders, with the care of someone who knows that too much force bruises and too little doesn't reach. "How long has she been like this?" I asked. The shivering. It just started. But the fever... Generosa closed her eyes for a second, as if it pained her to say it. "The fever has been climbing since last night. I thought it was the heat from walking. I thought if we stopped it would pass. It didn't. I did the math again, faster and more grim. 9 miles to Tesouras. At our current pace, with the stretcher and the care needed to avoid shaking her, it would take at least 2 hours. 2 hours with a high fever and septic shock. It wasn't enough. I stood up and walked a few paces ahead, out of earshot of the children. Generosa followed without being asked. She already understood that code. When adults step away, it's because what's coming isn't for a child's ears. "Tell me the truth," she said before I could open my mouth. That woman disarmed me every time. "Your mother has blood poisoning," I said, direct but quiet. "The shaking is a sign that her body is losing the battle. If we keep this pace, we won't get there in time." She absorbed it without blinking. "So what do we do?" "2 options," I said, looking at the road. "First, I get on Tamanco, gallop ahead, reach Tesouras, get a car or call someone to come get you. But that leaves you here on the road with her and the kids for at least an hour. And the second option? We pick up the pace. It'll shake the stretcher more. It'll hurt her, but we'll get there faster." Generosa looked back at the stretcher where her mother was shivering in silence. She stayed quiet for 10 seconds. I respected that silence. It was a decision-making silence, the kind you have to make alone, even if people are standing right next to you. "She spent her whole life suffering," Generosa said finally, her voice low and firm. "She can take one more pain. What she can't take is us arriving too late." I nodded. "Then we pick up the pace." We went back. I adjusted the stretcher, tightening the lashings on the sides to reduce the sway. I folded the second blanket under Miss Benn, cushioning her as much as possible. I put the damp cloth which Generosa had saved on her forehead, tied in place with a strip of cloth. Artur watched me do all of this with keen eyes. "Will she be okay?" he asked. I looked at him. Some kids can handle the truth, and some can't. Artur was the kind who could. I'd seen that from the start. "We're doing everything right," I said. "That's what matters now." It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was what I had. He nodded slowly, as if he'd weighed it and found it enough. We started again, now at a faster trot. Miss Ben groaned at the first few jolts. Generosa walked alongside the stretcher the whole time, one hand lightly touching her mother's arm with every step, as if the touch were a wire keeping her connected to the world. I led the way with Arthur, guiding the rhythm. The sun was at its peak. That hour of the day when the plains look like they're made of brass, everything shines, everything burns, and the shade vanishes from under the trees as if it had given up. The dirt road reflected the heat from the ground up, making the air shimmer in front of us like standing water. Arthur was quiet for a long stretch. Then he said, without turning, "Miss Grasser is asleep again." I looked back. Generosa was carrying the little girl in one arm while walking beside the stretcher with the other. Grasser had her head on her mother's shoulder, eyes closed, breathing evenly. "Does she sleep that easily?" I asked. "When she's hungry and tired, yes," Arthur said. "My mom says her body shuts down to save energy." That response from an 8-year-old left me speechless for a moment. "Your mom is smart," I said. "Yeah," he agreed, simple. Another mile. 2 more. Miss Ben's shivering had lessened a little, which in other circumstances would be a relief. But I knew that shaking that stops during a high fever sometimes means the body has stopped fighting, not that it's better. So I didn't relax. We were about 4 miles out when it happened. Serena stumbled. She didn't fall. She corrected herself, with that reflex of an experienced mare. But the stumble caused a sharp jolt to the stretcher, and Miss Ben, who was lying on her side, rolled slightly toward the edge. Generosa reacted fast. She set Grasser down with Arthur in one swift motion and caught the stretcher with both hands, stabilizing it. But Miss Bene had been startled awake. She opened her eyes. She looked at the sky first, disoriented. Then she looked at Generosa. And something on her face changed, a recognition that came from a place deeper than consciousness, that place where we keep the faces we love. "Gee," she tried to say. Her voice was dry, scratchy. "I'm here, Mama," Generosa said, and for the first time since I'd met that woman, the firmness in her voice cracked, just a little. But I heard it. Miss Bennet turned her head slowly and saw me. She watched me for a moment with those dark, deep eyes. "Who is this man?" she asked her daughter, her voice a thread. "He's a rancher," Generosa said. "He's helping us." Miss Ben looked at me for one more second. Then she said, with a clarity that was surprising for someone in her state, "You have the face of a man who has lost someone." I didn't answer. She closed her eyes again, but it stayed in the air, hovering over the hot road like something that wouldn't go away easily. "You have the face of a man who has lost someone." I pulled my hat down a little further and tapped Tamanco forward. We had 4 miles to go, and that was when I heard it. Still far off, but unmistakable, the sound of an engine. On the dirt road ahead, where the curve tightened and the overgrown brush hugged both sides, a cloud of dust was rising. A vehicle was heading our way, moving way too fast for a road like that. I squinted. I recognized the pickup truck before I saw the driver's face, and when I did, my stomach did a slow roll, because I knew who it was, and I knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was the trouble I didn't yet know I'd invited into my life. Arriving. The first storm. There are men you recognize before you ever see their features. It's the way the dust kicks up, the speed that disregards the road conditions, that specific kind of hurry that isn't about urgency. It's about dominance. It's the gait of a man used to arriving somewhere and making everything bend to his will. The truck pulled up about 30 yards from us. White, crew cab. It had a bumper sticker from Sterling that I recognized on sight, the kind you'd see parked outside the county clerk's office or down at Miller's General Store every week. The driver was out before the engine even cut off. Elias Thorne, mid-50s, sporting the gut of a man who ate well and worked very little, wearing a wide-brimmed hat he wore more for the status than the function. He owned 3 spreads in the county, 2 debts I never understood how he hadn't gone under from, and a reputation that depended entirely on who you were asking. To the men who worked for him, he was demanding, and sometimes worse. To those who owed him, he was a nightmare. He stepped out and stood in front of the truck with his thumbs hooked into his belt, surveying our strange caravan. 2 horses, an improvised stretcher, a woman holding a child, a boy with the look of someone who wasn't planning on moving an inch. He looked at me. "Mr. August," he said, using the name like he was doing me a favor. "Elias," I replied dryly. He shifted his gaze to Generosa, and when he did, I saw it. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. He knew her. "Generosa," he said. His voice shifted. It dropped, grew more controlled, the kind of tone that makes the words sound calm but carries a jagged edge underneath. "I knew you hadn't gone far." She didn't answer. She stood still, holding Grace, her eyes locked on him. Her expression was different from anything I'd seen on her until then. It wasn't the exhaustion from before. It wasn't the grit from before. It was containment. It was the look of someone who had learned that any reaction becomes ammunition. "What's going on here?" Elias asked, and the question was aimed at me, but his eyes stayed on her. "I'm taking a sick woman to Sterling," I said. "She needs a doctor immediately." "That woman is her mother," he said, jerking his chin toward Generosa. "And she," he took a calculated pause, "is in debt to me." The silence that followed had real weight. Arthur, who was holding the horse's reins, stiffened. He didn't look at Elias. He looked at the dirt. In that way, a child learns to become invisible when adult danger shows up. "How much?" I asked. Elias looked at me with a half-smile that wasn't friendly. "That's between her and me, August." "Now it's between you and me, too," I said, "because she's under my care right now, and her mother needs medical attention that cannot wait for this conversation." He tapped his hat lightly against his thigh, like a man measuring his own patience. "She left without notice. Left me with a loss." He paused. "She worked for me, August. She left with what was mine." "With what was mine," Generosa said. It was the first time she'd opened her mouth since he stepped out. Her voice was low but steady. No trembling. It had that quality of something kept locked away for too long, that finally found the latch. "The wages you owed me for 4 months," she continued, "that I had to go to the store to collect because you wouldn't pay in cash. The ones you called theft." Elias narrowed his eyes. "You took more than what was yours. I took what I needed to get my sick mother and my children out of there before it got any worse." A pause. "You know exactly what I'm talking about." That part of the conversation had an undertone I didn't fully grasp yet, but I grasped enough. "Elias," I said, putting that tone in my voice we use when we aren't making a request, "this woman will answer for whatever she needs to, in the right time and the right place. But right now, she's got her mother between life and death on a blanket stretcher in the middle of the backcountry, and I'm not going to let this matter delay what needs to be done. You're going to let us pass." He looked at me for a long second. Elias Thorne was many things, but he wasn't an idiot. He knew what I had in this county: land, time, the respect of the people who mattered. He knew that a fight with me on the side of the road wouldn't end right there. "You're sticking your neck into business that isn't yours, August." "Maybe," I said, "but I am." Another silence. He looked at Generosa one last time. Then he looked at the stretcher where Miss Bennet lay still, a cloth on her forehead, her breathing short and ragged. Whatever he felt looking at that, he swallowed it down. "This conversation isn't over," he said slowly. "Not today," I agreed. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he climbed back into the truck, put it in reverse with more force than necessary, and vanished down the road, kicking up a curtain of red dust that took a while to settle. I watched until he was gone. Then I turned around. Arthur was watching me with those dark, serious eyes. "He'll come back," the boy said. It wasn't a question. "He will," I agreed. There was no point in lying to him. "But today we don't need to think about that." Generosa had bowed her head. Her shoulders were a bit hunched, and I realized she was trembling slightly, not from fear, I think, from relief. The kind of relief that comes after the tension snaps and the body finally decides it's allowed to feel what it had been holding back. "Are you all right?" I asked. She raised her head, she nodded, but her eyes were brighter than before. "Thank you," she said. Just that. I didn't reply. I went to the stretcher to check on Miss Benny. The fever was still there. The tremors had returned, weaker, but they were there. Her lips were parched, her breathing had that ragged rhythm that worried me. "She needs water," I said. "Be careful, don't let her choke." Generosa grabbed the canteen and knelt by the stretcher. I held Miss Ben's head up gently, while Generosa dabbed water onto her lips with a cloth, slowly, just enough to dampen them. Miss Ben swallowed by reflex. "A little more," I said. "A little more." She didn't wake, but her breathing evened out just a fraction after that. "Let's move," I said, standing up. We had 3 miles to go, but as I mounted to Manco and we got moving again, one thing kept hammering at the back of my mind. Elias had arrived too fast. The road he came from wasn't the main highway into Sterling. It was a detour, a path that someone who didn't know the region wouldn't take by accident. He wasn't just passing through, he was looking. And if he was looking, it meant he knew which way they'd gone, which meant there was someone in Sterling who knew we were coming. I scanned the road ahead, long, straight, empty, for now. When the land tightens the net, there are things the backcountry teaches you that no school can. It teaches you that silence can be a warning, that the wind that suddenly dies didn't stop for no reason, that an animal pricking its ears heard or felt something the human eye hasn't caught yet. I've lived 58 years on this land, and I've learned to read those signs like other men read the morning paper. Not out of talent, but out of necessity, out of survival. And in that moment, everything around me was telling me that the danger hadn't left with the dust from Elias's truck. It had only changed form. Tamanco walked with his ears swiveled forward, occasionally turning his head to one side or the other, as if monitoring something I hadn't pinpointed yet. Serena, who was calmer by nature, also had her neck held higher than usual, her eyes wide, just a hair more than normal. I trusted them both. I've always trusted a horse more than a good many men. "Arthur," I said softly, without turning my head too much. "Yes?" he replied, riding ahead of me. "When you left Elias's ranch, which road did you take?" He thought for a second. "The back road. My mum said we weren't to go by the main gate. And did anyone see you leave?" A longer pause this time. "There was a man at the corral, Ditino. He saw my mum pulling the cart, but he didn't say anything. He just watched." Ditino. I knew that name by reputation. A permanent ranch hand at Elias's place for years, the type who mixes loyalty with fear and can't tell the difference anymore. That closed the loop. Elias found out from Ditino. He took the deer trail, which led to the middle of the route faster than the main road, and went to cut them off before they hit Sterling. What worried me wasn't what had happened. It was what was coming, because Elias had walked away too easily. A man with his hubris doesn't back down out of respect. He backs down to reorganize, to show up in a better position, with more weight on his side. And Sterling was his town, the county clerk, the general store, the councilman he funded, the sheriff who had lunch at his ranch every first Sunday of the month. If we rolled into Sterling without a clear plan, Generosa would arrive at the clinic only to walk right into a situation I couldn't control. I needed to think while we traveled, and I needed to travel fast. "Generosa!" I called, maintaining the horse's pace. She came closer, Grace still in her arms, now awake and watching everything with those big eyes of a child, seeing the world with real attention for the first time. "You said you took those items from Elias's store," I said, low for her ears only. "Can you prove it was owed wages?" She looked at me with that calculated expression. "I have a notebook," she said after a moment. My mother wrote everything down, every day worked, every agreed amount. She's done it since I was a child. She used to say rich men have lawyers and poor men have paper. A pause. The notebook is in the cart. I felt something loosen in my chest. That notebook cannot go missing, I said. It won't, she replied, and there was a certainty in her voice I wouldn't dream of questioning. 2 more miles. The sun had passed its peak and was starting that deceptive late afternoon decline, when you think the heat is going to break, but in reality the air just gets heavier, as if the heat from the ground rises to make up for the sun losing its strength. The dust on the road had turned golden, and the tree shadows had stretched a foot in either direction. Miss Benn groaned. I stopped the horses immediately. Generosa hurried to the stretcher, Grace sliding from her lap with the agility of a child who'd learned to look after herself when her mother needed her hands. Miss Benn's eyes were half open. It wasn't the confused waking of before. It was something different, more present, more agitated. Her eyes darted around, her breathing had grown shorter and more irregular, and she was trying to say something that wasn't forming right. "Mom!" Generosa called, kneeling beside her. "Mom, I'm here!" "Gee!" Her lips moved. "Gee! Run!" "We're almost there, Mom. We're almost there." "Run!" she insisted, and her hand, which had been limp at her side, rose a few inches in a gesture that seemed to cost a massive effort. He doesn't... "I know, Mom." Generosa took her mother's hand with both of hers. "But we're safe now. There's a good man here." Miss Benn's eyes stopped darting. They found mine, that look again, the one that cut right through you. For about 3 seconds she held my gaze, her breathing shallow, the fever burning on her skin that I could feel even from a distance. And then she said, clearer than I expected, "Take care of them." It wasn't a request. It was a handing over. It was the kind of thing you only say when you've assessed the person on the other side and made a decision from the bottom of your soul. I held her gaze. "Consider it done," I said. She closed her eyes. Her hand went limp in Generosa's. But Generosa didn't let go. She stayed there, kneeling, holding her mother's hand, head slightly bowed, in a silence I respect as much as I respect a prayer. Grace had crept near without anyone noticing and was standing by the stretcher, looking at her grandmother with an expression that wasn't that of a 5-year-old. It was like someone much older, inhabiting a small body. She reached out and lightly touched Miss Beeny's tangled white hair, a gesture so soft and so precise I had to look away for a second. Arthur stood where he was, but I saw his jaw clench when he swallowed hard. "Let's go," Generosa said, standing up. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were rimmed with red. "We can't stop." I nodded. We resumed our pace. This time I picked it up a little, not enough to shake the stretcher too much, but enough to feel like we were gaining ground. The horses responded well. Tamanco seemed to understand the urgency was real, and Serena, tethered to the stretcher, adjusted her gait along with him in that harmony good horses develop when they're working together. We were 3 miles out when Arthur spoke. "There's someone standing up ahead." I'd already seen it. At the start of the curve that marked the final stretch before Stirling, where the dirt road met the first patch of gravel and the houses started appearing, scattered on both sides, there was a figure. It wasn't Elias's truck. It was a man on foot, standing in the middle of the road with his arms crossed. As the distance closed, I saw him better. A man about 40, gaunt, wearing a faded t-shirt and a knife in a sheath on his belt that wasn't hidden. It was there like a statement. I didn't know the face, but I knew the type. A ranch hand turned heavy for the sake of convenience. Not violent by nature, but he'd learned that violence was the currency that paid the best. I stopped the horses about 20 yards from him. The silence between us was heavy. "You can stop right there, mister." "August," he said. His voice was that of a man who'd memorized his lines but hadn't practiced enough to make them sound natural. "Mr. Elias sends word that the woman is coming with him to settle her debts, and the kids stay here until the situation is resolved." The kids stay here. I let that sink in. I processed what it meant, that he was actually proposing to leave 2 children on the side of the road as collateral, as if they were objects, as if they had exchange value rather than the worth of human beings. I felt a different kind of heat rising in my chest. It wasn't impulsive rage. It was that cold, organized anger that is far more dangerous because it doesn't waste energy on theatrics. The kind that straightens your spine and clears your mind. That's not happening, I said slowly and without raising my voice. Mr. Zaku said that. I heard what you said, I interrupted. Now you're going to hear what I have to say. I dismounted Tamanco calmly, held the reins in one hand, and took 2 steps forward. There is a woman on this stretcher with blood poisoning. She needs a doctor now, not later, not after some negotiation. Now, you are going to move out of the way, or you're going to have to explain to me how you'll look yourself in the mirror if this woman dies here because you were following the orders of a man who hasn't paid his workers. He looked at me. He looked at the stretcher. He looked back at me. Mr. Zaku is going to... Zaku isn't here, I said. You are, and you're the one who will have to carry the weight of whatever happens next. The man went quiet. I saw the moment he calculated. I saw him weigh his fear of Zaku against the reality I had placed in front of him. Not a threat, not a bluff, but the simple, brutal fact of an old woman dying because of an order he had the power to ignore. He unfolded his arms. He took a step to the side. He didn't say another word. I went back to Tamanco, climbed up, and urged the horse forward without looking back. Generosa passed the man without averting her gaze. Arthur walked with his head held high. Grasa, in her mother's arms, looked at the man with those large, solemn eyes, and then turned her head away, as if discarding something of no further importance. We turned onto the gravel road. The first houses appeared along the roadside. A wire fence, a chicken coop. A dog barked twice and gave up. The smell of wood smoke drifted from somewhere nearby. We had reached Oak Haven. I took a deep breath, but I didn't relax, because as we turned onto the main street, I saw Zaku's white pickup truck parked in front of the town's only medical clinic, and next to it, leaning against the hood with that sense of ownership some men never lose, Zaku Brando, waiting, with a smile that held no warmth at all. I stopped the horses in the middle of the street. I looked at Generosa. She looked at me. There was no fear in her eyes. There was exhaustion, there was weight, there was the hardness of someone who had walked until her soles were raw, but no fear. We made it, I said. We made it, she repeated. And then something happened that I hadn't expected. Miss Ben, there on the stretcher who had been quiet for miles, opened her eyes. She looked at the afternoon sky, which had turned that deep amber color the plains take on when the sun begins to set. The color that makes the world look like it's burning in a beautiful way. And she smiled, small, weak, but it was a smile, as if she knew from wherever she was that she had arrived, that the worst was behind her. I looked at that smile and thought of something Lindalva used to say when things got too heavy. Agostinho, you don't have to win every battle. You just have to make sure you don't give up before it's time. I hadn't given up. Now it was time to finish this. I dismounted Tamanco for the second time that day, tied the reins to the nearest post, and walked towards Zaku Brando with the calm of a man who had already decided what to do. The whole town, it seemed, was watching. Windows were open. People were on the sidewalks. The clerk from the general store next door stood by the doorway, a rag in his hand. Oak Haven was too small for this to go unnoticed, and I intended to use that. Zaku, I said, getting close enough that I didn't need to shout. There is a woman in urgent need of a doctor. You will step away from that door right now, or I will tell every person on this street what you did on your farm, that forced this family to leave in the middle of the night with a cart and a dying woman. He opened his mouth. You don't know what... I know enough, I said. And I have a notebook in Miss Benn's own handwriting that knows more than I do. That shut him up. For a full second he stared at me without speaking. I didn't blink. He knew my land. He knew my reputation in the county. He knew that whatever I said on this street would be taken seriously by the people who mattered. Slowly, like he was doing us a favor, he stepped away from the door. I turned to Generosa. "Go," I said. She went. With Grasser in her arms and Arthur by her side, she walked into the clinic without hesitation, without looking at Zaccheo, without looking back at me. She just went, with that straight-back determination of a woman who had been through too much to waste time on formalities. 2 men from the clinic and I carefully lifted Miss Benn off the stretcher and carried her inside. The last thing I saw before entering was Zaccheo climbing into his truck. He didn't say a word. He drove off down Oakhaven's main street, kicking up the usual cloud of dust, as if the world were obligated to clear a path for him. But this time, the world hadn't opened. I had stood in his way, and he was the one who had swerved. The waiting room of the Oakhaven Clinic had 4 orange plastic chairs, a ceiling fan that made more noise than breeze, and the scent of rubbing alcohol and scrubbed floors that mixed with the afternoon heat in a way that pressed on the lungs. I sat in the corner chair. Arthur sat beside me. Grasser stood for a few minutes observing everything with that serious curiosity of hers, and then simply rested her head on my lap and closed her eyes. I didn't move. My hand hung by my side for a moment, uncertain. How long had it been since I'd felt the weight of a child resting on me? Too long to recall exactly. It must have been from the days when Dirsche was small and would fall asleep on the sofa after dinner, and I'd carry him to his room. That memory came gently, without the usual ache. Slowly, I positioned my hand on Grasser's back, just so she'd feel someone was there. She didn't wake up. Her breathing grew deeper. Arthur was watching the hallway where his mother had disappeared with the nurses and his grandmother. He watched with that fixed, intense gaze of a child who has turned his own attention into a form of control, as if, as long as he kept watching, nothing bad could happen without him knowing. "She's going to be okay," I said. It wasn't a promise. It was what I believed based on what I knew. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, without taking his eyes off the hallway, "My grandma always said we don't die as long as there's someone praying for us. Your grandma is a wise woman." "Yeah," he agreed. "She prayed for me when I had pneumonia. Stayed up all night." A pause. "I think it's my turn." I looked at him. This 8-year-old boy, with the eyes of a grown man and a heart that was somehow still whole beneath it all. "Then pray," I said. He closed his eyes for a few seconds. His lips moved slightly, soundless. Then he opened them again and stared at the hallway, his expression different, quieter, more settled, as if the act of praying had clicked something into place. Time passed with the specific lethargy of a waiting room, the fan whirring, a door slamming somewhere in the back, a distant voice giving instructions, the sound of the street entering through the barred window, a dog, a child calling out, the engine of a motorbike passing by. Oakhaven was living its ordinary afternoon, while our afternoon felt like anything but. About 40 minutes later, Generosa walked out of the hallway. I stood up slowly, careful not to wake Grasser, who had turned on her side, her cheek pressed against my thigh, mouth slightly open. Arthur stood up quickly, his eyes on his mother, searching for the answer before the question. Generosa reached us. Her eyes were red, but there were no tears on her face. It was the redness of someone who had cried in private, in the bathroom or the hallway, and then washed her face and returned. "She's stabilizing," she said. Her voice took a small effort, the way someone speaks when they are holding back emotion, not out of shame, but out of the sheer necessity to keep standing. "The doctor said we arrived just in time. If we had been 2 or 3 hours later..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Arthur went to her and hugged her waist without a word. Generosa bowed her head, resting her chin on the top of her son's head, closing her eyes for a second. I looked away. That moment belonged to them. Grasa had woken up from the movement and was sitting in the chair, watching me with that sleepy, solemn expression. "Your grandma is going to be okay," I whispered. She looked at me for a second. Then she reached out her arms. I stood still for a moment, confused. She insisted, little arms open, the patient expression of a child who doesn't understand why adults take so long to grasp simple things. I picked her up. She rested her head on my shoulder, wrapped her small arms around my neck with that loose, trusting grip children have, and stayed quiet. I stood there in the middle of the waiting room with that girl in my arms, and something inside my chest was breaking and mending at the same time, in a way I couldn't name and wouldn't try to. When Generosa pulled away from Artur, she looked at me. She saw Grasa. And her face did that thing, that softening that happens when you see something you never expected to see, and suddenly it's there, and it's more than you can handle. "She never does that with strangers," Generosa said, her voice small. "Sometimes children see better than adults," I said. Generosa looked at me for a moment. "What is your name?" she asked. "I never asked." "Agostinho," I said. "Agostinho Pereira Luz." She repeated the name quietly, like she was tucking it away. "I'm Generosa das Dores Campos," she said. "And my whole life I thought this name was too heavy, that it was a name for someone destined only to carry burdens." I waited. "Today I'm thinking differently," she said. I didn't ask what she meant. I understood. The doctor came out to talk to me about 20 minutes later. He was a young man in his 30s, with that demeanor of someone trained in the city who had learned to work in rural areas with a mix of adaptation and resilience. He looked at me with the quick assessment of someone used to identifying who is in charge in any given situation. "Are you a relative?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm a neighbor." He accepted that without questioning it. "She has early-stage sepsis," he said. "We've started IV antibiotics. The fever should subside in the next few hours. Her leg will need daily dressing for at least 10 days, and she needs to be on bed rest." He looked at me. "You know you reached the limit." "I know. 2 more hours, and I wouldn't have given her a chance." "I know," I repeated. He nodded with the seriousness of a doctor who wants to be sure the gravity of the situation has been understood. "She will be admitted overnight, maybe tomorrow too, depending on how she responds to the antibiotics." A pause. "Does the family have a place to stay?" I looked at Generosa, who was sitting with her 2 children, Grasa asleep again, this time in the chair next to her with her head on Artur's lap. "I'll take care of it," I said. The doctor returned to the hallway. I went to Generosa and sat in the chair opposite her, leaning slightly forward. "Your mother will stay here tonight. The doctor needs to monitor her." She nodded. "You need a place to sleep." She looked at me with that look, the look of a woman who knows what lies behind an offer and needs to calculate the price before accepting it. "There's no price," I said before she could ask. "There's a room in my house that hasn't been used since my daughter left. There's food, there's water, and there's distance from Zaqueu Brandão, which is what matters right now." She remained silent. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked. It wasn't suspicion now. It was genuine. It was the question of someone who needed to understand. I thought of the honest answer. "Because my house has been empty for 4 years. I said slowly, "and too much emptiness makes a man forget what the things he has are for." She watched me. Then she said softer, "Mr. Agostinho, I have no way to pay you back for what you did today. I'm not asking for payment, but I need you to know that I know the magnitude of this." That hung in the air between us for a moment. "I know you know," I said, and that was enough. I took care of what needed to be taken care of that afternoon. I went to the store owned by Mr. Alindo, who wasn't one of Zaqueu's men, but a man who stood for himself, which is a different thing entirely, and bought what was on the list Generosa gave me: rice, beans, cornmeal, sugar, oil, soap, a can of sardines, a box of milk crackers. I also bought a pair of sandals that seemed to match her size, judging by memory, and 2 pairs of children's sneakers, asking Mr. Arlindo to guess the size. I got Arthur's size wrong, too big. I got Grasa's right. After that I went to the sheriff's office. Not out of any illusion, I knew that a sheriff in a small town has his loyalties, and I suspected those in Oakhaven. But I went because absence is interpreted as weakness, and I wasn't going to let them interpret it wrong. I sat in front of Sheriff Marcos Falcão, a man in his 40s with a trimmed mustache and the expression of someone who had seen plenty and chose to be surprised by very little. I told him what had happened on the road. The stretcher, the sepsis, the man with the knife on the road, Zakiu at the clinic door. He listened with professional attention. "Mr. Zakiu has a theft report filed against this woman," he said when I finished, "and she has 4 months of unpaid wages recorded in a notebook written in the hand of Miss Benedita Campos," I said, "who is functionally illiterate, but still insisted on recording every day she worked." A pause. "That notebook is stored in a safe place." Falcão looked at me. "Stored where?" "With me," I said. He drummed his fingers on the desk. "Mr. Agostinho, you're getting yourself into a situation that someone needed to get into," I said. "And since there didn't seem to be any other volunteers, I'm offering." He was silent for a moment. "I'll talk to Mr. Zakiu," he said finally. "See if there can be an agreement." "A fair agreement," I said, standing up. "Not an agreement dictated by whoever has the most power in the room." He didn't answer. But the way he averted his gaze told me the message had landed. I returned to the clinic just as the sun was settling on the horizon. Generosa was sitting next to the hospital bed where Donna Bene was sleeping, hooked up to an IV, her breathing more regular. Arthur was on the other side, engrossed in a worn-out comic book someone from the clinic must have left behind, reading with that serious intensity of his. Grasa was curled up in a blanket in the corner, oblivious to the world. Donna Bene's color was better, not good, but better. That jaundiced yellow from the high fever had given way to a more natural flush, and her breathing, previously erratic, had settled into a steady rhythm. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the scene. Generosa spotted me. She stood up silently and walked to the door. We stood in the corridor, facing each other, the smell of antiseptic hanging in the air and the ceiling fan humming its useless tune. "How did it go at the sheriff's office?" she asked. "I planted the seed," I said. "Now we wait to see what grows." She understood. "And the notebook?" "It's here." I pulled it from my inner jacket pocket, where I'd tucked it away when she gave it to me earlier. "I'll keep it safe until it's needed." She looked at the notebook for a moment, that old thing with its stiff cardboard cover stained by time and yellowed pages, an object that was so much more than paper. "My mother started writing in that when I was 6, she said. "She didn't know much, but she knew enough. She used to say the boss could shout, he could threaten, but he couldn't erase what was written down." I looked at the notebook in my hand. "Donna Bene is wiser than most men I know," I said. Generosa took a deep breath. "Mr. Augustine," she began, "you can speak freely. I need you to understand something." She looked me dead in the eye with that unwavering gaze. "I didn't leave Zakiu's ranch just because of the wages, and it wasn't just because of my mother." She chose her words carefully, like someone speaking of a heavy load she didn't want to drop. "He had a habit of getting too close, of doing favors that weren't favors at all, of demanding things that were never part of any deal." She paused. "When I realized he was looking at Arthur the same way he looked at me, I packed our things that same night. The silence that followed was heavy in a different way than before. I held onto it, let it settle. 'You did the right thing,' I said, my voice firmer than I'd intended. She nodded once, slowly. 'The problem is, doing the right thing and being safe aren't always the same thing.' 'They aren't,' I agreed, But sometimes we find someone along the way who helps bridge that gap. She looked at me for a moment. Then very slowly, as if it cost her more than anything she'd done all day, more than pulling the wagon, more than standing up to Zaku on the road, more than holding her mother's fever-shaking hand, she let her shoulders drop. She didn't collapse. She just let the weight land for a second. And in her, that was everything. I stayed still. I didn't offer a hug. I didn't say a word. I just stayed there, present, which is sometimes the most important thing one human being can do for another. After a few moments, she lifted her head, took a deep breath, and said, her voice returning to normal. She woke up earlier and recognized me properly. She called me by the nickname she's used since I was a little girl. She offered a small smile. Neguinha. Something loosened in my chest. A good sign, I said. The best, she agreed. From inside, Arthur's voice came softly, calling his mother to show her something in the comic. Generosa looked at me one last time. Get some rest, mister. Augustine, you said it yourself. You have the face of a man who has lost someone. I nodded. I have. Well, she paused. You haven't lost the ability to care, and that's not a small thing. She went back into the room. I stood in the corridor alone for a moment, the fans spinning, the smell of antiseptic, the afternoon light filtering through the frosted glass window, painting the floor in a weary orange. I thought of Lindalva. I thought of the empty room. Of the porch chair where I sat every day, staring at the high plains without really seeing them. And for the first time in a long time, I thought of those things without feeling only the void. I also felt what was surrounding the void, solid ground, which still held me up. There is a time of day in the high plains that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. It's when the sun has finished setting, but the sky hasn't gone dark yet. That 15-minute interval where the horizon looks like embers fading, orange turning to purple, then deep blue, and the twisted trees of the scrubland are silhouetted against the light, as if someone had sketched them in ink against the sky. The day birds have quieted, and the night ones haven't started yet. The world falls into a silence that isn't empty. It's full, in a way you feel in your chest, without knowing how to name it. I was sitting on the clinic porch when that time arrived. Tamanco and Serena were tied to the post, drinking from a bucket I'd had the boy from the general store fetch. Tamanco looked at me once with those deep brown eyes, as if assessing whether the situation was resolved, then went back to his water. Serena didn't even lift her head. She knew it was time to rest. I'd sent a text to Wanderson earlier from the payphone in the square, as my battery had died before noon. I just told him I was okay and would be home tomorrow. He'd call back, and I wouldn't be there to answer, and he'd worry, and I'd have to explain later. It was fine. Some explanations are better left until the dust settles. I had Donna Bene's notebook on my lap. I hadn't opened it. It wasn't my place. But I held it with both hands, feeling the weight of those pages that a semi-literate woman had filled with crooked letters and straight-back determination for years, recording every day of work as if she knew, deep down, that one day it would matter. And it had. Generosa's footsteps on the wooden porch warned me before she spoke. She sat down next to me on the wide step, knees tucked, arms resting on them. She was barefoot. The sandals I'd bought were the right size. I'd noted with satisfaction when she accepted them without comment, meaning they fit. For a moment, we just watched the sky change color. She's sleeping, Generosa said. The fever dropped more than a degree. The doctor said at this rate she might be discharged tomorrow afternoon. Good news, the best I've heard in a long time. Silence. The sky turned from orange to purple as we sat. I've been thinking, she said after a while, about what you said about the empty house. I didn't answer. I let her continue. We left with only what fit in the wagon, she said, which wasn't much. A bundle each, my mother's things, her notebook, a pot, 2 blankets. She paused. I have nowhere to go, no money, no job, and I have 2 children and a mother who will need care for at least another 2 weeks. She said it all without drama, with the raw clarity of someone who looks at their own situation without the luxury of denial. "I know," I said. "I'm not asking for a handout," she continued, her voice holding that familiar firmness. "I'm proposing work. I've worked since I was 12. I can cook, I can clear brush, I can milk, I can tend a garden, I can sew, I can do whatever is needed. When my mother recovers, she'll work too. She's faster in the fields than men half her age." She paused. "And Arthur has carried the responsibility of an adult for a long time." I looked at the horizon. That deep purple the plains turn when night is settling in to stay. "There's a piece of land next to the house I've never been able to work alone," I said slowly. "A couple of acres of good soil that have been lying fallow for 2 years for lack of hands." I paused. "There's a small guest room out back that used to be my son's, separate from the main house, with its own bathroom. It's not big, but it's clean and has a bed." I paused again. "And there's a porch that sits empty every afternoon, which is a waste of a porch." Generosa stayed quiet. I kept looking at the horizon. "I'm not offering a favor," I said. "I'm offering an agreement. Work in exchange for housing and a share of the harvest, while the situation with Zaku sorts itself out, and you plan your next step calmly." I turned to look at her. No rush, no debt. She stared at me for a long time. There was a lot in that look. Assessment, gratitude, residual suspicion, careful hope, that whole mixture of someone who has learned not to trust too quickly because quick trust has cost her dearly before. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. But this time it was different. No suspicion. It was a real question from someone who truly wanted to understand. I thought for a moment. For the honest answer, the deepest one. "Because I spent 4 years convincing myself that silence was the same thing as peace," I said, "and today I remembered it's not." I looked at the notebook in my lap. "Your mother looked at me today and said I had the face of a man who had lost someone. She was right. I lost my wife. I lost the way my house sounded when there were people inside. I lost the habit of having someone to do things for." I paused. "I'm not saying you're here to fill that void. That's not how it works. But sometimes life sends a situation you can't steer away from. And when you stop trying to avoid it, you discover that the detour was costing more than the encounter." Generosa looked at me for a while. Then she looked at the sky. The first star had appeared, the one that always shows up before the others, alone for a few minutes until the rest arrive, as if it had paved the way. "My mother will want to thank you in her own way," she said, her tone carrying something new, lighter, closer to warmth, "which is by cooking for you for 3 days straight, until you beg her to stop." I let out something that wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "It's been a long time since anyone cooked in that kitchen," I said. "Then it's a deal," she said. "It wasn't exactly a formal contract. But it was the kind of thing that, when 2 people say it while looking at the same horizon, becomes firmer than anything signed on paper." Donna Bene was discharged the following afternoon. She left the clinic in a makeshift seat that Generosa and I fashioned with our arms interlocked, because she was too weak to walk alone, but too proud to be carried like she had no say in the matter. Arthur went ahead to clear the way. Grassa walked beside, holding her grandmother's hand and whispering things I couldn't quite hear, but that made Donna Bene smile, that small, firm smile I'd come to know. I'd borrowed a better wagon from Mr. Arlindo, with aligned wheels and wood that didn't creak, to take them back to the ranch. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was enough for today, and today was what mattered. When we were almost out of town, Donna Bene pulled my arm. I stopped. She looked at me with those deep, dark eyes, the fever gone, the clarity back in a gaze that could see through you. "Augustine," she said, using my name as if she'd known me for years. "Donna Bene, you have something planted on that ranch that isn't corn," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not knowing where she was going with it. "You have faith planted there," she said, "even if you don't know it. Only someone who believes there will be a tomorrow to harvest plants like that." I had no answer. She patted my hand, the way old folks do when they want to signify that a conversation has reached the place it needed to reach, and turned her head forward. We kept moving. The road back had the same heat, the same red dust, the same high plains on both sides, with that raw beauty of things that don't need approval to exist. But it was different. Not the road. Me. Artur rode with me on Tamanco again. This time he didn't need an invitation. He just came up beside the horse and reached out with the natural ease of someone who already knows there's a place for him. We rode for 2 miles in silence. Then he said, "Mr. Augustine, go ahead. Was your wife a good person?" The question came from an angle I hadn't expected, as his questions always did. "She was," I said. "Would she like having us there?" I thought about it for a moment. I thought of Lindalva and the laugh that started in her eyes. I thought of the way she welcomed people into her home, anyone, in any situation, with that generosity that wasn't a performance. It was who she was. I thought of what she would have done if she'd found Generosa pulling that wagon on the road. I didn't have to think for long. She would, I said. She'd bring everyone inside, make coffee, and she'd already be asking if your grandmother wanted her to apply some home remedy to her leg. Artur was silent for a moment, processing. "Missing someone is hard," he said. "It is. But my mom says that the kind of missing that hurts is for something good that actually existed, and that something good that existed doesn't go away for good." I looked at the horizon ahead, the plains opening up on both sides, the dirt road stretching straight as far as the eye could see, the sky that deep blue that only exists in the backcountry, far from everything that pollutes. "Your mother is very wise," I said, for the second time that day. "I already told her that," he said. "She says wisdom is just suffering that turned into experience." I couldn't respond to that, because it was just too accurate to have a comeback. When the ranch appeared up ahead, with the 3-bedroom house and the swept porch and the plains all around as they always had been, I stopped Tamanco for a moment, just to look. There was something different about seeing my own house through the eyes of someone arriving with people. The house hadn't changed. I had. Generosa pulled up alongside with the wagon, Donna Bene resting in the back, Grassa in her lap. "Is this it?" Generosa asked. "This is it," I said. She looked at the house, at the porch, at the yard where the old mango tree still cast shade in the afternoon, at the wattle and daub fence I'd never repaired because it hadn't been urgent enough. "It's beautiful," she said. "It needs a hand," I said. "We've got hands," she replied, and it was as simple as that. That night, for the first time in 4 years, my kitchen smelled like a real home. Generosa had insisted on cooking. Despite me telling her she needed to rest, she gave me that look, the one I knew better than to argue with, so I simply backed out of the kitchen. Mrs. Bene was resting in the spare room, Dirtsu's old room, which I had furnished with a new mattress I'd picked up in Red Creek before I left, with her leg propped up on a folded pillow. She was already giving orders, drinking an herbal tea she'd made Generosa fetch from a neighbor's garden before we'd left town. That was a good sign. Grace had found the farm's old cat, Pingo, an 8-year-old orange tabby I'd had since he was a kitten, usually a stray-hating loner, curled up in her lap, purring like they were long-lost friends. Grace sat on the front porch steps, hands buried in his fur, looking perfectly content. Artur was in the yard. I watched him through the living room window. He'd found my hoe leaning against the siding and was examining the handle with the gravity of a man appraising a vital tool. I stepped outside. He heard me and looked up. "The handle's a bit loose," he said. "Yeah, been meaning to replace it for a while." "I know how to fix it," he said. "My grandfather taught me. You soak it, grease it up. Tomorrow, you teach me," I said. He looked at the hoe, then at me. "It's a deal." We stood in the yard for a moment. Two men watching the high plains, dusk turn to dark, the cicadas starting that rhythmic, piercing hum that fills the air from horizon to horizon. "Mr. August," he said. Thank you." Just like that. The way a child says it when they mean it, without frills or ceremony, just the word and the weight it carried. I put a hand on his shoulder for a second. I didn't need to say anything. Dinner was beans and rice, seared salt beef and cornmeal. The same thing I'd eaten alone for years, but sitting with 4 people around the table, Generosa beside me, Arthur opposite, Grace in the chair I'd brought in from the room, and Mrs. Ben, who refused to eat in bed, claiming that was for the terminally unlucky. The simple meal tasted different. It wasn't the seasoning. It was the noise. The clatter of spoons, Grace spilling beans and cleaning them up with her fingers before her mom caught her, Arthur asking for more meat, Mrs. Bean commenting that the beef was good, but she knew a way to sear it that was even better, and Generosa replying that her mother said that about everything she cooked. I stayed quiet, eating slowly, listening. It was a sound I hadn't heard in ages, the sound of a house being lived in. Generosa glanced at me, catching my silence, her eyes asking, "Are you okay?" I nodded. After dinner, I sat on the porch. The sky over the plains at night is something else. With no town lights to wash it out, every star holds its place, the Milky Way cutting across like a smear of cold, ancient light. I'd watched it every night since Lindalva left, and it was always the same, beautiful in a way that aches when you're alone. Tonight, Grace sat next to me, without asking. She just settled into the small chair I'd kept since Patricia was a girl, with Pingo in her lap. We both stared at the sky. "There are so many," she whispered. "Yeah, how many? More than we can count." She thought about that. "My grandma said when we go away we turn into stars." I looked at her. "Your grandma is still here," I said. "I know." She scratched Pingo's ear. "But she was talking about later. She said she'll be the star closest to mine whenever I'm missing her." I looked back at the sky, searching for the first star of the evening, the one that leads the way. It was there, it always was. "You know what I think?" I said. "What?" "I think people we love don't go to the stars. They stay even closer. They stay in the way we act when nobody's looking." I paused. "They stay in the smell of the kitchen, in the way we sweep the porch, in what we do when we find someone in need on the road." Grace was quiet, processing that with the wisdom of an old child. "So your wife helped you help us?" she asked. I was speechless for a second. I thought of Lindalva, her floral dress in the photo, the laugh that started in her eyes. I thought of what she would have done in my place. No hesitation, no calculation, no need for 4 years of isolation to remember that caring is what gives the land its meaning. "I think she did," I said. Grace nodded, as if it were the most logical thing in the world, because it was. Later, when the house had settled and the kids were asleep on the floor mats, Arthur had insisted in that prideful way of his, Generosa came to the porch. She stood in the doorway. "Can't sleep?" I asked. "Not yet. The head doesn't shut off so easily after a day like today." "I know," I said. We sat in silence. A toad croaked near the trough. The wind moved slowly, the fresh evening air of the plains clearing out the 40-degree heat of the day. "The situation with Zaku isn't over," she said. "It wasn't a worry, it was a fact." "No," I agreed. "But it's different than this morning, because of the ledger, and because of what you told me about Arthur." I paused. "That doesn't stay between you and him. That will be told to whoever needs to hear it." She looked at me. "You don't have an obligation to be involved." "I am involved," I said. "Since I grabbed the reins of that wagon, I've been involved. There's no turning back. Do you regret it?" I thought about the day, the road, the stretcher, Zaku, the man with the knife, the clinic, the police station, the crowded dinner table, the stars. I thought of 4 years of an empty porch. "No," I said. "Quite the contrary." She took a breath and said something unexpected. My mother has a habit of naming things that matter. She'll want to name today. What would it be? She'll call it the day we found the corn farmer, she said, a hint of a smile in her voice. I looked at her. For the first time in 4 years, I really smiled. Not a polite half grin, but the kind that starts deep down. The kind Lindalva used to say was the only real smile. It could be worse, I said. The next morning, I woke at 5. I made coffee, but as I went to sit alone, there was an extra mug on the table. Artur stood in the doorway, hair a mess, eyes squinting, but with that same steady, determined posture. My mum taught me that in someone else's home. You wake up early and you help, he said, his voice raspy. I can help with whatever you need. I looked at him, then at the mug, then at the kitchen, smelling of brewed coffee and old wood, and now of people. You can, I said. Coffee's hot. Then we'll check the cattle. He sat down, wrapping his hands around the mug the way old-timers do, and we drank our coffee in the silence of the high plains as the sun climbed behind the twisted trees. It was just another day, except it wasn't. It never would be again. What the land gives back, they say the plains don't forgive those who don't respect them. But they also say, the old-timers, the ones who walked this land barefoot, that the plains hold on to what is planted with intention, that the earth has a memory, that it knows the difference between a taker and a stayer. I never knew if I believed it, until that year. 3 months later, the farm was different, not in a flashy, renovated way that strips the soul out of a place, but organically. It changed the way things change when the right people show up and start working without needing a contract to know their place. The acre that had been fallow for 2 years was cleared, fertilized, and planted. Generosa knew more about farming than I'd given her credit for. She had an intuitive connection to the dirt. She talked to the land the way I used to talk to Tamanco, not in words, but in a language of attention and respect. Mrs. Bean had recovered with what the doctor in Red Creek called remarkable speed. I called it stubbornness. She called it obligation. I've got a grandson to raise and land to work, she told me when I suggested she rest. I'll rest when I'm dead, August. It's not time yet. She was back to the ledger, but it wasn't for tracking owed labor for a landlord anymore. It was for the farm, crops, births, repairs. I saw her on the porch one afternoon, writing in that crooked, honest hand, and stopped, not wanting to disturb her. You're staring again, she said without looking up. I am. A man who stares instead of asking is a man with things on his mind. I was thinking you should have been a teacher, I said. She snorted. Not a teacher. But my mother used to say I should have been a judge. She said I had a gift for seeing what people hid. You do, I said. The Zacu Brandon situation didn't end quickly, but it ended justly. Mrs. Benet's ledger, in the hands of a lawyer I brought from St. Felix, a trusted son of an old friend, was enough to build a rock-solid case. 4 months of withheld wages, documented day by day, plus testimonies from Generosa and 2 other women who'd worked for him. Zacu tried to settle twice. I told Generosa to refuse. By the 3rd time, the amount was fair, what the lawyer called a settlement, and I called the price of arrogance. When Generosa finally held the check that October afternoon, with the sun streaming in and Pingo sleeping in the corner, she looked at the envelope for a long time. It's enough to start, she said. It is, I agreed. I don't have to stay out of obligation anymore, she noted. It wasn't a threat. It was just her, direct and honest. It was never an obligation, I replied. She looked at me. I know, she said. That's why I'm staying by choice. It hung in the air, not a romantic declaration, just the simple truth of 2 adults who'd survived enough to know that life is lighter when shared with someone who respects the load. It was enough. It was more than I'd ever hoped to find. Artur learned to handle the hoe by the 2nd day, By the third, he was in the pasture with me at dawn, checking fences. By the end of the month, I had a farmhand who charged only for a slice of corn cake per job, his demand, not mine, and possessed more responsibility than any man I'd ever hired. He learned to milk Morena with a patience that even surprised the cow, who was notoriously wary of strangers. He learned to identify the flora of the plains by the shape of a leaf. I taught him what I knew, and Mrs. Bean filled in the rest. He learned the name of every animal on the farm and addressed each one by name from the first day, because he said an animal with a name responds differently. I didn't disagree. He was right. One afternoon in November, we were repairing the water trough in the lower pasture, that bolt I'd been needing to replace since before everything started, and he fell quiet for a while as he worked. That silence of his that I already knew held something inside. "Spit it out," I said. He gave me a lopsided smile, a quick grin that was exactly like his mother's. "I've been thinking I'd like to go to school," he said. "My mom always says that an education is the one thing no one can ever take away from you. Your mother speaks the truth. The school in Oakley has an opening. My mom went to check." He tightened the bolt with care. "But I don't want to leave the farm." He looked at me. "Can I do both?" I thought about it. About my own children, the three I'd raised trying to balance school and farm work, with mixed results depending on the child. "You can," I said. "It's more exhausting, but you can." "Then I want to do both," he said simply. "It's a deal." He went back to the bolt. Then, without looking at me, "Mr. August." Can I call you something else?" "Not Mr. August." I stopped. I looked at him. That 8-year-old boy with the eyes of a grown man and a heart that was still whole. "What would you like to call me?" I asked carefully. He thought for a second. "Uncle," he said, "if you don't mind." A pause. "It doesn't have to be for real, just a name that fits better." I stayed silent for a moment. Something moved in my chest. It didn't ache. It was different. It was the kind of thing that makes space instead of closing it off. "You can," I said. He nodded, serious, as if we'd just signed something important. Because we had. Grace was the final surprise. Not in a bad way, in that way you don't expect. But when it arrives, it feels like it was planned by someone with more vision than we have. She had that quality of a child who observes more than she speaks, who hoards more than she shows, who understands the room with a precision adults lose when they get too set in their own ways. And she had chosen to adopt me. No ceremony, no declaration, no asking permission from me or her mother. She simply decided I was part of her family and treated it as a settled fact. She'd wake me by knocking on my bedroom door at 6:30 every morning with some urgent question that invariably could have waited. She'd appear at my side when I was on the porch, as if it were her natural place. She'd show me things, leaves, stones, bird feathers, anything she found in the yard, with that random and sacred collection of a small child who finds treasure everywhere. And on a December afternoon, she came running across the porch with something in her closed hand, her face wearing that specific seriousness I'd learned meant important news. "Uncle August," she said. I looked at her. My heart did something different when she said it. It wasn't the same as what Arthur had asked. It was more spontaneous, lighter, the way a small child does things without knowing the weight of them. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice normal. She opened her hand. It was a stone, small, round, the color of red clay with a white vein running through the middle. "I found it on the path to the pasture," she said. "It's pretty." "It is," I agreed. "It's for you," she said, handing it to me with that total seriousness of someone giving a gift that cost attention and choice, which is the most expensive kind. I took the stone, small in the palm of my hand, warm from the sun. "Thank you," I said. She nodded, satisfied with the transaction, and ran off after Buster, who had passed by the back of the yard. I kept looking at the stone, that bit of the plains that was worth nothing and everything. I put it in my shirt pocket. And there it stayed. On the last day of that year, I did something I hadn't done since Lindalva left. I went to her grave. The cemetery was 4 miles from the farm, in a small town with a nice name and a rough road. I went by copper as always, on an afternoon that was cooling down with that year-end breeze the plains send as if it were a gift. I stood in front of the simple stone for a while. I didn't pray out loud. I've never been a man to pray out loud. But I talked, the way we talk to those who left but haven't gone for good. I told her what had happened. I told her about the road, the wagon, about the corn, which hadn't been the important part of the story since the second I saw the eyes of those children. I told her about Generosa, and the rope on her shoulders, and the way she didn't run, didn't hide, just kept going. I told her about Miss Bonny and the notebook and that gaze that could see through you. I told her about Arthur and the hoe handle and the way he drank coffee like an old man. I told her about Grace and the stone in my pocket. I told her about the dinner table, about the noise of an inhabited house, about waking up at 5 to the smell of coffee I didn't make. I stayed in silence for a moment after all that. The wind passed, and I said finally the thing I had come to say. You were right, Lindalva. I still had things to do here. I just needed a push of the kind you always knew I needed. The wind passed again. I put my hand on the cold stone for a second. Thank you, I said, and I left. When I got back to the farm, the sun was almost setting. That hour again, the orange turning into purple, the trees in silhouette, the birds changing shifts in the silence between their songs. The porch had the light on. Generosa was sitting there with Miss Bonny, both with cups in their hands, talking in that low mother-daughter way that needs no volume because they already know the path by heart. Grace was on the ground with Buster. Arthur appeared at the door when he heard Copper arriving, stepped down the 2 porch stairs, and came to take the reins. He had taken that on as his role without anyone asking. "Good afternoon, Uncle," he said, holding Copper firmly. "Good afternoon," I said, dismounting. Generosa looked at me from the porch. She didn't ask where I'd been. She knew, the way she knew things, by observation and respect, without needing to ask what wasn't hers to ask yet. She only said, "There's hot coffee." "I'm coming," I said. I took care of Copper first, always Copper first, since, always, because that is what is owed to the one who carried us through the world. And then I climbed the steps. I sat in my chair. Miss Bonny handed me the cup without me asking. Grace left Buster and came to settle by my side with that total naturalness. The plains were in front of us, enormous and dark and full of invisible life that sang on every side. And I stayed there, with hot coffee in my hand, and that stone in my shirt pocket, and that noise of people around me, looking at the horizon I had watched alone for 4 years. I wasn't alone anymore. Not because the loneliness had ended for good. Loneliness doesn't end like that. It learns to live with company. It gets smaller but doesn't disappear, and maybe that is how it should be, because it was what kept me on my feet while the void was bigger. But it was different. It was the right size. Outside the planes were singing, and I was listening.